Design Patterns with Jeremy Clark.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, which is a full-service software architecture and engineering firm that loves to empower software delivery projects. And my architect forums are going strong. You can sign up for the next session on the website, clearmeasure.com. If you lead a software team and you're looking to collaborate with peer architect leaders, then just sign up at the link in the show notes. There's all kinds of resources for developers out there, but not so much for people who are leading teams of developers. So that's what this is aimed for. And for those of you looking for my Programming with Palermo video podcast, just search in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. Now, my guest today on the show is Jeremy Clark. And Jeremy helps developers by sharing his own struggles, mostly in technology, but also with being more social as an introvert, understanding potential for learning and playing banjo. And he's worked as a corporate developer, as a chief improvement officer at a startup, and as a contract developer. And currently he teaches developers through online courses and workshops and tech articles and conferences. And he spends most of his time in C#, but he's recently ventured into Golang and Rust, and he likes exploring some of his favorite topics like interfaces and delegates, concurrency, and parallel programming. You can see him speaking next at Live 360 in Orlando, Florida. That's November 12th, the week of November 12th, 2023. You can use the promo code Clark to save $500 on that ticket. And you can also, on the week of October 23rd, you can see him at DevSpaceConf in Huntsville, Alabama. So Jeremy, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. You know, you've done so much speaking in your career, so many tutorial videos, taught so many developers. You've gotten to this level of expertise that is just kind of like at the top small percentage of the industry. But I want to kind of back up. What were some of the high points in your career that you think are, formational that helped actually achieve, that level of industry expert?
Well, I'm reluctant to call myself an expert in anything just because I know there's people that know a lot more than I do. My career was pretty slow. I kind of started out programming by taking hotel reservations at a company, and through a series of events, I ended up on the programming team. And on that team, it was my first professional programming job, but I was surrounded by senior devs who really liked to share. And it was just a great environment for me to grow in. And so, that kind of inspired me to share with other developers. And also it definitely made me not afraid to ask questions and not afraid to say, I don't know. I think where a lot of people get into trouble is when, we bluff our way and we say, oh yeah, I got it. I have no idea what you're talking about, but yeah.
And when did you decide that you were or that you loved teaching? Like you spent all this time, you learned a lot of stuff around development and done a lot of programming, but you said, you know what? I'm going to teach other people.
That's actually also pretty interesting because, you just mentioned that I'll be speaking at Live 360 in Orlando in November. While I was a corporate developer, I used to attend that conference. Okay. And I always thought, it'd be cool to be up on that stage, but it's like I'm a corporate developer who is not doing bleeding edge stuff. Who cares? And then there was actually an influential episode of .NET Rocks, and they had a panel discussion, and it was this would be about 2009, so quite a ways back. And so .NET had been around for a while at that point, And when they were talking about how when C# and .NET first came out, everybody was talking about the basics. Like, here's the garbage collector, here's how types work, here's all of this stuff.
Yep.
But then as time went on, it turned into, oh, here's, WPF or WCF. And, that's gone now, but it was new at the time. And so everybody was talking about, here's the new stuff.
A high level.
And they were saying, well, who's going to bring the new people in, talking about kind of those basics.
Yeah.
And I took that as a challenge. I'm like, well, you know what? I'm not doing cutting edge stuff, but I can do core stuff. I mean, that's what I do all day long. So I actually ended up signing up to speak at a local code camp in Southern California. And I was a little ambitious. I decided to do 3 talks my first time out.
That's a workload.
Yeah. But, I practiced and practiced and practiced. And I was hooked the first time I did it, because I got up in the room, I knew my material, and while I was speaking, I saw the light bulbs go on in the room. And, suddenly I had this realization, I just helped these people. Yeah. I just made somebody's job easier. I just made somebody's life better. Yeah. And at that point, I was immediately hooked, and I started trying to figure out, how can I do more of this? So, and that was back in 2010. And it's been a long road since then, but it's really strange to think about, particularly Live 360, like you mentioned, a conference I used to attend. Now I'm speaking at, and it was a slow process, mostly user groups and code camps when I was first starting to speak, but then slowly kind of regional events that, had a ticket price associated with them. And I've had the chance to speak internationally and all across the US as well. So I just have loved having those opportunities and love sharing my struggles, basically. So any talk that I do is something I struggled with. So it's like, okay, this was hard for me. How can I make it easier for someone else?
Right. Well, my favorite definition of an expert is someone who has learned something, who has gained some expertise, and then shares it with someone else, because the act of sharing gained expertise is what makes you an expert to that other person. If you learn something, if you're great at something, and then you never share it, well, nobody knows. And someone's only an expert is if someone else knows, meaning that expertise has been shared, and now they can know.
I will accept that definition of expertise.
Awesome. Well, you've given talks on this, but I wanted to ask, and this is one of those basic topics where, we could talk about the whiz bang, full stack, Blazor, Maui, Azure Service Bus, and all this container, this and that. But one of those things that was talked about a lot 20 years ago, 30 years ago, is design patterns. And I want to kind of get your take on that, because you've helped a lot of people on design patterns. But let's start at the basics. What are design patterns? What is a design pattern, and why should we care?
So those are 2 separate questions. As far as what patterns are, it's, without going into the official definition from the Gang of 4 book, it's a solution to a common problem. And it's not a specific solution. It's referred to as the core of a solution to a common problem. So the idea is that I have this problem. For example, I need to get notified when a state changes on an object. And so the idea behind a pattern is, okay, well, we have this problem in place that is very common in our environments. How can we solve this? And it's not necessarily saying, okay, well, here's the 3 lines of code that you write for it. It's more setting up, here's the big pieces and how they might communicate with each other. And the specific implementation is actually up to you as the developer. So that's why patterns are so interesting. Kind of the thing that got me started talking about them was when I was working a corporate job, and the developer who sat next to me, he had about 10 more years experience than I did. So he was quite a bit senior to me as a developer. And one day he just pops up over the cube wall and he said, I've been using the Facade pattern without even realizing it.
Nice.
And I'm like, okay, that's cool. It's like he just discovered that he's been doing something. And it's actually something you're kind of supposed to do, right? It's a common way to solve a problem. And I thought that's really cool because now, he has a new tool in the toolbox. But I was also thinking, well, this is also sort of a problem because what patterns really give us is when we learn them and we learn the types of problems that they're there to solve, now we have somewhere to look. So, I described that notification problem earlier. Well, that actually is how the observer pattern is described. And the idea is that now that I can put a name to it, I can call this an observer. Now I can go start looking for solutions to it.
Yeah.
And once you put a name to it, now you can find solutions. And then, you know, design patterns, kind of the original Gang of Four book goes back to 1994. So that was quite a while ago.
Yeah.
And it's easy to think, well, these don't really apply to us anymore. But I think it's just the opposite because, in the Gang of Four book, they might describe, okay, well, here's the observer pattern and here's how we can set up this notification. And now with our modern languages, we have so many implementations of this pattern built in that we can go and grab. So kind of the simplest one in C# is an event handler. That's a really simple way to do a notification. Something I've gotten into since I've been dealing more with parallel programming is channels. And that's a way to communicate across threads even. And there's also reactive extensions. And there's this, and there's that. And C# actually has a pair of interfaces, an IObservable and an IObserver of T, if you want to kind of build your own. So it gives you like the framework that you can build with. But, the important part is that if I know that I need an observer, now I can go start looking for those solutions since I've been able to put a name to my problem.
Yeah. That's a really great point and really great example because everybody needs observers. And code A, something happens on code A and code B needs to do something. But we don't want code A to know about code B. And so we need to set up some type of indirection and there's the pattern.
Yeah.
So the Gang of Four book, you're right. It's a really old book. I don't know how many, let's say, current decade programmers have read that book. I haven't seen it being talked about in the up and coming developer curriculum or whatnot. But in your opinion, should new developers read that book, or are there some other newer material that you'd recommend? What's your opinion on that?
So the Gang of Four book is important. I'm going to leave that there. It's also very academic.
Yeah.
So I had a copy on my shelf because every good developer of the era that I was doing corporate development had this book on their shelf. And I tried to read it like 3 times and failed miserably each time because I wasn't ready for it yet. So I would say Gang of Four book is an important book. And it's something that I think people should read at some point in their career, but there are definitely much more approachable ways to get there. So there is a book called Head First Design Patterns, and that's from O'Reilly. And the Head First series is really designed to try to stuff information into your head in a way that you'll remember. So it's much more approachable. And that book actually deals with 12 of the patterns that are in the Gang of Four book and starts off with exactly the same definition. So they're not coming up with something brand new. It's something that's there and approachable. And the source code for that is, I believe it's Java, but there are online repositories that have C#, which is the world I live in, JavaScript, basically any kind of language you can think of. There's a repository with the examples. As far as like, how important is it now? It seems like I've been doing this long enough to see design patterns kind of wax and wane. So it's kind of that pendulum swing that goes back and forth between, oh, everything's a pattern and, oh, this is miserable. Everything was a pattern and they tried to overdo patterns and now it was a disaster. So we're not going to use patterns at all. And then it's like, oh, well, we didn't use patterns at all. And so now it's a disaster. And so now we're going to look at patterns. So it seems like the pendulum swings back and forth, just like everything else, whether we're doing things client side or server side, everything. And I think it's the same with design patterns. It does seem like there's definitely a part of the community that has animosity towards them. And my guess is that it was a bad experience that
Mm-hmm.
led to that. I kind of have the same thing with abstraction. So I had a really bad experience with abstraction as a new developer. And it took me a long time to get over that and understand, okay, how can we find a workable balance?
Mm-hmm.
And so I see kind of design patterns the same way. If you overdo them, if you're constantly looking for them or constantly saying, oh, well, I have this pattern, I should write some code that uses it, then you're probably going to fail miserably. But if you are genuinely looking for solutions and say, okay, well, I have this problem. How do I find a solution?
Mm-hmm.
And hey, you know what? The bridge pattern is pointing me in that direction, or the facade pattern points me in a direction, then I think it's a great usable tool. So kind of like everything else, it can be overdone, and it definitely can be underdone as well.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery.
ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
There's one of the Gang of Four patterns that I don't think I've ever implemented in my career, but I use other people's implementation. Iterator. I don't know if I've ever implemented
Iterator,
but I used it because it's kind of baked in everywhere now. What other, like, what patterns do you think of fall in that category where they're just baked in and you use it without even thinking?
Yeah, well, again, I think it's great that they're baked in, because actually the Gang of Four book has an implementation of a list as a sample code that has an iterator in it.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm glad I don't have to write that code anymore.
Right.
Because, again, in the C# world, we've got IEnumerable. And IEnumerable is awesome because it lets us do for each. I think for each is awesome. And then one of the best things ever added to C# was language integrated query.
Yeah.
And IEnumerable makes that possible. So as far as like implementing my own enumerator or iterator, I haven't done it, but that doesn't mean that I'm not looking for that problem. I think a good, when we're talking in that direction, it's also trying to figure out how much or how little of something do you need. Because if you actually look at the interfaces that are part of like a list of T, for example, in C#, and interfaces is another area that I nerd out on. There's several levels. So the most basic is IEnumerable, and that's the iterator. And basically it says, okay, there is a method that says, give me the next item.
Right.
Give me the next item. Give me the next item. And if that's all you need, then just stick with that IEnumerable interface. If you go up the next level, you end up with a collection, and that has the concept of adding and removing items. And then if you go up the next level to list, you actually have the concept of position and indexes and add at this index or remove from this index. So we can actually say, okay, what problem are we trying to solve? And if I'm trying to solve, hey, I just need to be able to get the next item. Give me the next item, give me the next item, give me the next item. You know what? All I need is IEnumerable. And any object that implements that is going to work for me.
So there's design patterns for core code, but you've got all this external code. You got databases, you've got UI, you've got calling out to web services. And that whole paradigm is kind of new from 1994. Do you see classic patterns just being redirected, or are there, like, do you see net new design patterns that are really taking shape?
There's actually, I would say, new ones that are forming. So if you're looking at the UI world, if you've heard of MVC or MVVM or MVU, those are all design patterns. And MVC, for example, model view controller, is just describing, okay, well, here's three main pieces that we have. Here's how they interact with each other to create this UI, or the UI interaction, I should say.
Yeah.
And so there's another one, dependency injection. Dependency injection is actually a set of patterns, because you can break that down further and say constructor injection is a pattern where we're injecting things through the constructor. Property injection is a pattern where we're putting things into properties. Method injection is a pattern where we're putting things into method parameters. So there are new patterns that definitely the Gang of Four is not the be all and end all. It was just the beginning. Unfortunately, the question that I often get is, where is there a comprehensive collection of pattern that I can look through, like a pattern catalog? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know of one that exists. There might be one out there, and if one of your listeners knows, I hope they send some comments, because I would love to add that to my list of references.
Yeah, I think any field that has a design element probably has this concept of patterns that you can repeat over and over again. I've worked with an interior designer who can whip out cabinet shapes of kitchens and whatnot. I look at her and I can tell that she's assembling all kinds of different patterns and combining them in different forms. It's not like 100% bespoke custom. It's all these little combination of patterns that she's learned in her field.
Yeah. And actually, the definition that the Gang of Four uses for design patterns comes from Christopher Alexander, and it's actually from 1977. And he was talking about architecture, like real architecture with buildings and bridges. So that's where the concepts come from. And again, it's talking about problems that occur over and over again in our environment, and describe the core of the solution to the problem in such a way that we can use it over and over again. And that there's often multiple implementations. We don't necessarily have to do it the same way each time. So if you think about, I need to, create a span. I need to, build a bridge of some kind. That's a common problem. And then how you implement that, whether you use an arch bridge or a suspension bridge or the various other types, there's a lot of solutions to that problem, but you have somewhere that you can start.
Yeah, that's a good point. I need to fasten two boards to each other. I've got a few proven solutions. I don't need to fabricate my own nail or my own screw and all that. So all of these in C#, all of these patterns kind of use interfaces. I want to ask you about just abstraction in general. Well, when I was young, I remember conflating the concept of abstraction with interface. And I thought, just because I was using an interface, therefore I had some good abstraction. How do you think about that concept when it comes to patterns?
So abstraction is another topic that I'm really big on.
Okay.
And one of the reasons for that, one of the reasons I talk about interfaces so much, is because that was actually a concept that was hard for me to understand when I was new to programming. So, I kind of saw the mechanics of it, but I didn't really understand the why of it. And it took me a while to understand the why. And like I mentioned, I did have a bad experience with abstraction. And basically, I ended up supporting a project that was badly designed and over abstracted and was very difficult to debug. And in fact, it was very difficult just to compile. And that's never a good thing. So, I kind of have this idea that kind of by default, developers fall into one of two states. You're either an under abstractor by default or an over abstractor by default. So I was an under abstractor by default. And so what that meant is I needed to learn how abstraction works, what the benefits are, and, kind of how do I get those benefits? Because if you have code that's under abstracted, it's difficult to maintain and change. Now, on the other side, if you have code that's over abstracted, it's difficult to maintain and change. So there's a sweet spot somewhere in the middle.
Right.
I had a coworker who was definitely an over abstractor by default. And so whenever a user requirement would come over, he'd be thinking of, okay, well, they want these two things, but here's these 5 other things that might happen at some point in the future. So I'm going to build this huge plugin architecture so that we can do this when we need it. And I'd be like, well, let's take a step back. Okay, let's leave a spot for that plugin architecture. So we don't want to code ourselves into a corner, but let's go ahead and make sure that we're not building something that's just going to make things harder to maintain. And same thing would happen in the other direction. He'd come over to my desk and I'd be like, okay, so here's how I'm doing this right now. And he's like, well, you've got some code duplication here. And, you really could benefit by splitting this up, putting a layer of abstraction in between so that you can switch things out. So, again, through years of experience, you kind of learn where the sweet spot is in the middle. And the unfortunate thing is the sweet spot varies by application. So you can't just say, here's the perfect number of interfaces to have. Here's the perfect level of abstraction to have. The way that I think about it, I'm going to talk about my friend Barry Stahl, because this was very eye-opening to me, because I was kind of at the point with interfaces where I was saying, well, I don't want to add an interface to my code simply so that I can add a test to it, right? It's like, I don't want to modify my production code and make it harder to maintain in order to add tests. I'd rather be able to test the code that's there.
Yep.
And, and I would say, I was talking to my friend Barry, and he's big on testing, and he would like as much code coverage as possible from a philosophical standpoint, not from a metrics standpoint.
Yeah.
And so I would say, well, I don't want to add an interface because I only have one implementation of this thing. And so why would I do that? And he said, no, actually, you have at least 2 implementations, because you have your production code and you have your test code.
Yep.
And that was eye-opening, because it's like, oh, you know what? Maybe I am okay adding that level of abstraction to my code if it does make it easier to test. The other thing that he said that just blew my mind, we were talking, he's very much, again, very high on testing. And at the time I was kind of like, well, I test kind of my core business logic, the things that might be confusing, but other things I don't really have tests for. And so we were kind of talking about, well, how do you decide which part of your code is okay not to test?
Yeah.
And he said, which part of your code do your users not care about? And that was eye-opening. It's like, oh, okay, my users care about all of this, so I should care about all of this. So I should make sure that I have tests against all of it. So those were kind of the 2 big things where Barry was influential in my life.
Nice. Yeah, because that is, you call it a pattern, a testing philosophy. Yeah. What part of the code is it okay if it breaks or stops working without us knowing about it? And a certain type of, like the large scale tests, or even a full system test that tests a whole lot of stuff, if it breaks, that's helpful because something broke. But the larger, the broader the test is, it doesn't really pinpoint and say, and the problem is here. And so it's that trade-off. The smaller tests down to the individual unit tests, if they break, they basically shine a direct laser. That code is busted. Whereas the broader test is like still useful, but then you have to figure out, okay, what actually in this sequence, what actually broke?
Yeah.
Well, cool. I like this guy, Barry.
Yeah, Barry Stahl. He's awesome. He's out of Arizona. I got to know him through code camps and various local speaking events. I don't know if he gets out to speak very much these days, but he's pretty amazing to talk to.
Yeah. There are still so many developers I run into that are not yet doing any kind of regular test automation. When you start a new greenfield project, or when you're helping other developers start just a net new code base, what do you think about that? When do you recommend or introduce the first testing bits?
So I'm kind of a practicalist when it comes to unit testing. So I know there's people that are 100% TDD. You write, test-driven development. You write a failing unit test before you write any code. If you do it any other way, you're doing it wrong. I'm not good with pedantic philosophies.
Mm-hmm.
If that works for you, great. I'm all on board with that. I tend to do personally what I call test alongside. So I'm not necessarily writing my tests first, but I'm generally writing them at the same time as I'm writing my code.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as far as introducing it, I think getting testing in as early in the process as possible is usually a good approach because it's very easy to write code that is difficult to test.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you come at it from the beginning saying, okay, well, we have tests against these various places, then maybe we are breaking things up into more atomic, actual functional style methods that have discrete inputs and outputs that are easy to unit test. Maybe we have a spot where, let's think about putting an interface in here because, it's a dependency that this test is going to need. And so if I can add that here while I'm writing the code, it's going to be a lot easier than coming back later and doing it.
Yeah.
The other thing is that I did a contract job where I was doing the presentation logic for an application.
Mm-hmm.
And I was having to deal with services that did not exist yet, but I knew what the data was going to look like.
Yeah.
So I could mock those up for my tests, and I could continue doing all of my work without any working services because I had tests in place that would provide me with the sample data, put it right into my code, the same spot the real services would put their data into the code,
Mm-hmm.
and just be confident that, assuming that my test data does match what's coming from the service.
Sure,
Once we actually plug it in, it's going to work. And so, especially in a team environment, it's a lot easier if you kind of are able to mock out some of these things so that your tests are really what's telling you that you're moving forward and you're doing things correctly.
Yeah. Yeah. That's some good points. I tend to favor the test alongside as well. And really, I find if I submit a pull request or if someone else submits a pull request, you can't really tell how that went. You just know that, hey, there's new code coming in and it has tests coming in with it. And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So awesome. Well, hey, this has been really fun. Before we go, are there any of your training or your publications that you want to highlight that would be useful to developers listening? Because you've put out so much educational content, but are there any that kind of stand out among the rest in this topic?
So I actually do have a Pluralsight course on design patterns, which is a bit too long, to be honest. But I am working on bringing my YouTube channel back up to speed. I do have a lot of good things on my YouTube channel. It's Jeremy Bites on YouTube. I'm Jeremy Bites pretty much everywhere online. So jeremybites.com will get you to my website.
B-Y-T-E-S.
B-Y-T-E-S.
Yep.
And you'll also get to my social media accounts and my YouTube and my GitHub and various things there. So on YouTube, I do have some series that I'm very proud of that have to do with asynchronous programming. So learning about task and await specifically in C#. They are 7 years old. The interesting thing is that my current presentations that I do about those really haven't changed other than to say I'm now using Visual Studio 2022 and .NET 7. The core concepts have stayed the same. So I have some stuff out there about asynchronous programming, also about delegates, which I think are really cool. I actually do have some TDD tutorials out there for people who might want to learn more about that. So that's out on my YouTube channel. I do have quite a few things on my blog as well. And my most recent things have been talking about nullability in C#. So that's something that's recent in the last 6 months. That's one of the newer things. And I like to talk about that because it doesn't really do what I expected it to do when I first heard about it.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure there's a lot of other people that are like, well, this doesn't do exactly what I expected to do. So what is it good for?
Yeah.
And how do we actually use this to our advantage? So that's mostly what I focus on these days.
Yeah. Yeah. Big topics. Awesome. Well, Jeremy, hey, I appreciate you coming on the podcast and sharing with us your experience with design patterns. I know that the listeners have gotten a lot of value from that. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
No, my pleasure indeed. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.